All right, so there are still seats kind of if you're finding a hard time hearing. You're welcome to move forward, and there are seats here at the front. Stuart does have a microphone, but there are plenty of seats in the first 2 rows, especially going down if they're looking for a seat yet. So welcome. This is the second in our Global Environmental Speaker Series. And we're really lucky and fortunate to have Stuart Marks give the talk this evening. So Stuart has had quite a career in academia and in the NGO world as an anthropologist, sociologist, and wildlife ecologist. So really appreciate your coming here today, Stuart. Dr. Marks earned his PhD from Michigan State University in ecology and anthropology back in 1968. And then since that time, he and his wife Martha, who is here today as well, have been quite busy bridging work in the United States and in multiple countries in Africa. From 1970 to 1985, he was a professor of anthropology and environmental studies at St. Andrews College, then went on to UNC, Chapel Hill, where he held the business scholar, lectureship, research professorships. Meanwhile, he was doing work in Africa throughout that whole time. Senior Fulbright research professor in Zambia from 1988 to 89, and has continued to stay active with the Fulbright program. In 1990-92, he was a rural sociologist in Botswana, working on a project funded by USAID. 1995 to 2001, he held a senior scientist title with the Safari Club International Foundation, with wildlife conservation grants in Zimbabwe, Tanzania, and Botswana. So all these things, if you kept track of that timeline, he was working in North Carolina as he was doing all this other work, holding all these various titles as well. Authored over 80 research articles, 70 books, and at least 2 of which kind of informed some of his material here today, talking about community-based natural resource management and ecology. One of them, most recent one is, I think you maybe have a copy there as well, right? Life as a Hunt, Thresholds of Identities and Illusions of an African Landscape. Talking about community-based natural resources. Speaks 5 or 6 languages, and I could go on and on. Right? So I think it's really fortunate that Stuart and Martha have retired to the Richmond area, where he maintains quite a bit of activity and has a courtesy appointment in biology, as we see here. So really a tremendous asset to have in our community, and it's our pleasure to welcome you to the Global Environmental Speaker Series. So welcome, join me in welcoming Stuart.
Well, thank you, Todd, for expanding my credentials immensely. I hope to be good, but I'm not sure that I ever was that good. And thank you all for coming and attending this evening. I mean, it is an imposition. It's rough. It's raw outside and damp. And but I hope this will be a learning experience for you as well and worth the effort. I want to talk today about a contemporary problem that's still very much with us. Well, first of all, let me pay homage to this environment because I'm impressed by this magnificent campus. I mean, this is an ideal setting, a privileged setting, really, to spend 4 years in your lives, to really planning, getting ideas, talking to professors. There's immensely gifted faculty here in all different shades and disciplines, and I hope that you're using it to your best advantage. You're figuring out what you want to do in your life, or at least getting a start on that life journey. Believe it or not, I was there at one time where you sit. It was a long time ago. My class was 1961. We thought it was a kind of a magical date to get a degree because you could read it forwards or backwards or up or down. It came out the same thing, right? It was a 1 in a 6 either way, or 9 in a 6. So what I want to talk about is a current event. Here's a recent article in the American Scientist, February 2018. It's called Living in Elephant in an elephant landscape. And that's what I'll be talking about today. You know, I like two things. I'm attracted to two things. One is animals. I like animals from whenever I could remember. And I like people just as well. And when I was sitting there, those were seen as two different disciplines. Really, you went with people and you got into the social sciences, you got into natural science with biology. Those were two different. And yet, I had an experience abroad that suggested that really they were not two different disciplines at all. That there were people who lived with wild animals and made a livelihood out of that same environment, in which wild animals were part of that environment for them, and they pay a high social cost for that, and also benefit enormously from it. It's what we would like sometimes, perhaps in our best days, to experience and to enjoy. I like my animals wild, so that I don't have to clean the barn. They're there, they take care of themselves. I can enjoy them when I see them. The subtitle of this article is, "The local communities most affected by wildlife conservation often have little say in how it is carried out, even when policy incentives are intended to encourage their support." So where does this come from, and how does this do it? And my name of my topic is Culture, History, and Politics, the Conservation Dilemma in Southern Africa. And I suggest that really in order to resolve that kind of dilemma, you can't see that as separate disciplines. You have to see it all together. Because we are maybe animals, we aren't autonomous animals, we are a life form who really attach ourselves very much to culture. That's what has enabled us to survive, we believe. We are separate from other animals. Some people see that as a significant advancement, or it may not, because we use our brain to make adaptations. We are inventive, we have evolved, and according to some people, we are different from animals. I'm not so sure, because we live in the same planet and we must share the same planet and the processes with them. We depend on other animals, especially think about all of the magnificent flora that is in our stomachs, for example, that we never give any thought to until they get upset. That's something we've done to them. So anyway, let me get on to the topic. Today I want to talk about a different place, and I hope that this is the commercial, that I hope that you're really beginning to examine your world as undergraduates and as adults, and not just look at superficial surface phenomena, things that may be normative or in the media, but you really try and put it together to try and understand what goes under those waves. Look under. It's not all surface materials. So my topic is on culture, history, and politics. The world was different in the late 1950s when I was going to school, but the winds of change were at large in Africa, and they would change things. That's another thing that I've learned, is that the change between your time and when my time is tremendous. Just ask some of the elders that you attend class with, or people in the audience, your grandparents, not your parents, your grandparents. They'll tell you about the kinds of changes that have taken place that they've had to cope with in their life. It's a different world, and it's in many ways a much scarier world. So my talk today is about a former British colony. I'll speak primarily to the issue of how people live with these wild animals, and successfully did that and survived in many ways. They concocted a management schemes which I've called lineage management, which is my term for what they did. This is an oral society. It's not written down. It's something that you have to put together, and if you're a member of an oral society, you learn just by growing up in it. It's like all cultures. Really, you learn by observing by other people teaching you what's significant in life, and you pursue that as goals in your life and livelihoods. But this regime enabled them to manage wildlife as competitors, as vectors of disease, as predators and being preyed upon. Some of them were killed and preyed upon by wild animals, and as powerful yet substantive symbols, as well as learning on how to live within an imposed political, economic, and cultural limits of place and time. And a lot of the things that they had to deal with was about imposed boundaries. Here's the place. This is the introduction to place. There are several things to call your attention to, several boundaries. There are topographical boundaries here. One is, oops. Okay. I'm sorry, I'm not in my world. This is not something that I grew up with that I have to deal with. Okay. Where's that pointer?
Try pointing at the back one.
Oh, there it is. Okay, there's a boundary. I can do better than that. Sorry. There is a boundary here, a physical boundary, and it's an escarpment. It's 2,000 feet deep. It's where the land has collapsed, and over on this side, on the east, is a river. Now those are boundaries, are physical boundaries. This is a physical and also a political boundary, because this is a different province from this one. This is Eastern Province, this is Northern Province. So in a way, these people are marginal, live in a marginal place. Very few people. In 1966, there were about 5,000 people living here, and water is important. Another physical feature. There's a river here and a river here that always has water in it. And here you see the clumps, these little dots here are where people have settled. That's their villages, and also their fields are nearby. There's also administrative boundaries that are imposed, and this is mentioned in terms of Eastern Province and Northern Province. If you wanted certain things done, you were in a different province. And the Mpika is the district within Northern Province, and it is here in the upper part of that cut rectangle there. That's the administrative center. Now to get from Nabwalia, which was the chief's village, up to Mpika was a 5-day hike on foot. That's a long way to travel. And see what else to show. Well, the other is these imposed boundaries of game reserves. That's a no-trespass zone for people. You had to have permits to go there. And all of this land that you can see below the escarpment was really Bisa territory, Bisa homeland at one time. But when it became a colony, there was a national government that set imposed boundaries on the country, and game reserve was one of them. So people living in the game reserve were asked to move. They had to move to somewhere else, given no choice. So that's the place. Now there are 2 seasons here. This is the wet season, and it's taken from an aeroplane right above Nabwalia, the place that I showed you was the chieftainship, and it's looking west. And there in the background, very faintly, you see that light blue is the escarpment. That's 50 miles, 60 miles away. And then there's all the eroded foothills that from the center of the left-hand bound all the way up. And then there is this level floodplain of the Munyamadzi River and the Luangwa River, which is still further east. And then you have these small groups of villages, a lineage, which I'll get to in a minute, here and here and here and across the river, and these fields that they have cultivated. And it's green. It's green for 6 months of the year because there's water, and you can see the river is in flood. Now remember this boundary of the foothills, because I'll mention that several times throughout the lecture, because that had an implication for not only people but also for animals. They had to, during the dry season, the other season of the year, which was dry, no rain, everything becomes parched. In fact, many people say that looked like a desert during those times. And water is very important for people as well as animals, and alluvial soils for crops. There were plenty of animals, and this is one of the things that they had to contend with. And it impacted their social system, their social organization. Yes?
Could you plug yourself back in?
The assistant will gladly do that. There you go.
Let's see what happened here. No track.
Hello?
There we go.
There we go. Got me now?
There we go.
This is a field. This is an abandoned field, and animals are welcome there. It was an integrated agricultural animal husbandry system. Again, they would fertilize the field. They would also eat the remaining crops, and it was all right for them to be there this particular season. But when it was growing season, which was 6 months of the year during the rainy season, they had to live in these small huts. That is a household. It would be a married woman with children whose husband was away, and this was the one on the ground was a kitchen. And you see 3 species of animals: waterbuck, impala, and zebra. Now your folder showed a bigger animal there. Those are the ones that you want to keep out of your field, because if they get in there, they can really, really cause a lot of damage, and your existence becomes at risk. Now, this is the chief. It was people, but the chiefs were different. They belonged to a royal clan, but they were appointed by the government. They were the lowest level of the national government in a village, was a chief. But he had to be of the right clan, a royal clan, and appointed and have a favorable disposition towards the administration. But traditionally, he was looked at as the owner of the land, because he was responsible not only for the productivity of the people, but also for the plants and animals that they depended upon. And rain was very important, so that every year they have a traditional rain ceremony, which he is leading the leader in. This is a small spirit hut, mfuba, that the subjects have constructed. And here is, each one of these little holes is one of the chief's ancestors. He knew his ancestors for many generations back. Most subjects really didn't know beyond 2 or 3 generations back. And a grandchild of his lineage has poured in offerings in each one of those little holes: flour, tobacco, and beer, in remembrance, things that the ancestors really relished. Those are goods that the ancestors would welcome and would hopefully reward them with a favorable growing season. This is also a place that has frequent droughts, and it's gotten worse with climate change, in which droughts occur once every 2 or 3 years, and it wreaks havoc with famine. What do you do in famine? You leave the country and you go settle with relatives who have married elsewhere. And then there's an elephant as a symbol of his, and you'll see that he has the one in the white shirt there with an elephant bracelet on his wrist. Now, he is an important subject for what I'm talking about, because it was he who was appointed once the Northern Rhodesia became a British protectorate. Before that, beginning in 1890, it was believe it or not, it was a commercial enterprise, and the government was a company, the British South Africa Company. When it went bankrupt, then it became under a British colony. Now, one of the things and he was, there were several Bisa chiefs that were old. They were usually old. Chiefs are old because it has to be in a lineage and you take them down sequentially. And they were not answering well to the British administration. And so they had to do something about it, because this is a place that was isolated. It didn't have much administrative supervision. They would come once a year, and it was a hardship for them, because if you know anything about British colonialism, they came in their own glory. I mean, they set a table set every evening with plates and cutlery and wine and all this kind of stuff, and had people dressed up in formal uniforms to serve them, etc. So it took a whole bunch of carriers to bring all that to provide those kind of services for them when they went on duty, what do they call it? District duties. Because every place they had to visit every year. But it was an imposition, and just the tour in the valley would take about 3-4 weeks. Now, he was chosen, they selected him because he was young. He had been to southern Rhodesia and worked in the mines. He knew Europeans, so they came back, interviewed him. He talked well. He was willing to do what they wanted. And the administration was primarily interested about animals. Why? Because that was game. That was game for them. That's what the British commissioners really like. They like to go hunting in a royal style, as only they can do. And they were, and also elephants in particular were part of the revenues that the colonial administration depended on, believe it or not. Ivory was a commodity that they taxed very heavily, and they also taxed you in licenses in terms of hunting it. And so he was responsible for that. Look after the game, but we also need labor. We also need labor because we have imposed a hut tax on a village, and they must pay this in cash, not in kind, in cash. So they have to come work for us. So you have a quota of men that you must supply us every year in order to pay taxes. Okay, so he established this lineage husbandry. He had some freedom to do this, and he was out of the government gaze. So the government didn't see him very often, but when they saw him, they always questioned him about what was happening. He established this regime where they could supply the needs of the lineage. The focus was the lineage itself, which was a village of, 15, 20 households? Not many people. It was a face-to-face society. And he had to do two things. Well, that's the next thing, because I want to take you through 3 generations of these lineage husbandry. They didn't call it that. That was my term. I had to, because this is an oral society, you absorb this knowledge of what it was by living there and being a young person and deciding that that's what I want to do. And there are 2 things that they could do. But the recruitment through interpretation of dreams, how did that happen? Children would follow their parents around. Boys would go with men in the bush. They would learn certain things about hunting and goods that were available out in the bush, and they would sometimes dream, and the people who would appeared in the dreams, they would know who they were, and then they would go to elders, because this was an elder-controlled society in which you would go to them, because that was the fountain of knowledge. They knew, they had been there before, and they were also accountable to the ancestors. The ancestors all often provoke these dreams. And that's something that the elders could do. There were rules regulating numbers and members and the behavior of members. But when the British came, they decided that since the company had taken up all of the guns because they were afraid of an insurrection, the British thought that at least they could give them these muzzle-loading guns, which were antiquated. The British didn't use them anymore, and that they had semi-automatic weapons and the like, and if there's any insurrection, they could master the situation. So they said, look, you can buy these guns from some of your lineage members who are at labor in the towns, and they can bring them back and use them in the village to protect yourself. So there was ownership of weapons, and there were three classes of men: the elders and the chief. Then there were individuals. What do you need from the men of your lineage? You need two things. You need protection and bushmeat. Why? Because bushmeat was important because they had no domesticated animals. They couldn't have them here. Why? Because of the tsetse fly. Do you know what the tsetse fly is? The tsetse fly is one of these intermediary hosts of a trypanosome, which is a little wiggly fluke that lives in the blood system of other mammals. Wild animals are immune to it, but people are not, or not immune to it. Neither are the domesticated animals. It's an acquired immunity. You have to evolve within that system in order to live there. And so these guns were important. So some people owned them, and others of them used them. But the meat belonged to the people to distribute who owned the guns. So there were custodians and hunters and traditional knowledge. There were things that how you organized yourself in terms of, and how you distributed goods like the meat that you brought back. But the main idea was the focus on the lineage, a very small group of which you were a member in face-to-face behavior, and that face-to-face behavior was the monitoring system for people living according to certain norms. There were certain norms in any society that you have to follow. Now, there were three generations. The chief brought all these people together, the elders in particular, and they decided, well, what do we need to do? We need to provide certain needs for the lineage. There's one for hunters. They stay at home. They don't migrate to the cities. And they also provide bushmeat to our relatives in the lineage. Okay, that's one group of them. The other is migrant laborers. And lineages need more than just nurturance. They need also cash to pay taxes, and also for cloth, for salt, and other necessities. And that's where it would come from. Purchases in the cities, and they would bring back. So there were these two groups of men, a very small group, no more than, say, 10% of any registered male in a village would be hunters. The most of them, the other percentage, would go off to the cities, to various jobs, working for Europeans, and come back occasionally with cash. Some of them would never come back, and you would never know why. They just disappeared. And they could disappear walking through the bush, trying to get to the cities. So that was one generation, and the chief and the older generation born in those two dates really conceived of it. It was theirs. It was their lineage husbandry. And I mention that because that's exactly what the community-based wildlife program that was instituted in the 1990s says it was concerned about. It was providing and meeting the needs of the lineage, and it was unable to do that. The second generation had guns. They really embellished it. The differences between, they made the distinctions very visible between what women did with their hoes and what they did with their guns. Guns was something powerful. It goes off with a sound. And they were real men. Unlike these other men who went off to the cities, who came back occasionally with goods and stuff, they were not real men. They were really slaves to foreigners and doing what they considered the foreigners wanted done, rather than being autonomous like they were, being real men, etc. They came up with this cult, which is called Ubwalwa Nebuchibinda, which is literal translation is beer. That's a substance that women took them a week to prepare, and then it was drunk over several days. And Buchibinda. So they were beer consumers and hunters. But that's one translation. The other translation, English has two meanings for hunting, and the other is venery. These individuals who stayed behind with all the other members of the matrilineage really contributed very much to the fitness of the next generation. Now, this third generation, born 1945 to 1960, really became of age in the 1980s and 1990s, and they wanted to do this. I mean, this was a career that youth could look forward to, of beer and hunting. You know, frivolous kind of things to do, or seemingly frivolous things to do. And yet, the game didn't belong to them anymore. They had to face the reality. They didn't have much education. They couldn't do much. They had to live like most of the people, and there wasn't much differential between them on the ground. The differentials were between age and gender. You're either a man or a woman. What I'm talking about is really a man's role in this society. Now, before they used to, when they didn't have guns, they could only hunt with bows and arrows. These guns here really revolutionized hunting and beast society in certain ways. But they become, like most recipient societies, of when they accept a new technology or new idea, they make it their own. And this gun isn't what you think it is. It's not a mechanical instrument that goes off, that has firepower, and you can really make calculations in terms of how much powder you put in it and ball size, etc. It is a living thing. It can be possessed, believe it or not, by spirits of animals which it hunts, or by spirits of other people, or envy or jealousy of other people. It can afflict the gun and make it inoperative. They know about these instruments. Blacksmiths can make them out of trash heaps and metal dumps around every city there in the tropics. So they know how to make them, and most of the villagers had illegal guns. They were not registered. They did not produce revenue for the state. But what happens? This is an individual. He was also a member of the royal lineage. He expected to be chief. He hoped to be chief, but he was denied that. They brought someone else from the outside to be chief because the government wanted to implement this community-based program. He had a number of children. He had 2 twin sons who he was very proud of. Having twins was an exceptional birth. And he got them employment as game scouts in the new program that was coming in. And one of them was shot by another scout in a buffalo ambush and killed him. And you can imagine what that does to a father to have one of his prized sons shot by someone else. It was an accident, of course, but why did it happen? He was struggling with that. He was also struggling with keeping animals, providing animals for his small family. And he had gone out several times hunting. He had wounded animals. They had escaped. He was unsuccessful. What was he doing? He was washing a gun. Ever heard of anybody washing a gun? Taking out the impurities, taking the things out of what was causing the trouble. Here he is. You do it, you have to know how to do it. And he's doing it in a certain place. It's not like a shrine. It is where it's a rubbish heap. It's on the edge of a village where the things that they glean from the forest and from the bush come in, they use them, and then they throw the rubbish out, and then it goes back into the bush. And he has a broken plot here, another symbol, and he has some magical herbs or things that are powerful in their own selves, which can take out that kind of whatever it is that is inherited and afflicted his weapon. It's a strange way of looking at things, but it's a way of understanding uncertainty. We don't understand uncertainty either. We may rationalize it as chance, but it's still there. This is a way of doing it. I can do something about my uncertainty, and so I can purify this gun. It takes place, and I do that by pouring that medicine, put water here, you can see where some of the moisture has spilled out, down the barrel, and it cleans it, and it comes out the nipple, and I put it in the sun, and it warms it, and it makes all those spirits, or whatever it is, disappear. And my weapon becomes operable again. And then you go out, and then he would, after it warmed in the sun, he would take it inside his hut, and then early the next morning, he would get up, he would have a seance with his guardian spirit, and he would find out whether it was an animal spirit. If it wasn't an animal spirit, then it would be another way that he could find out what was wrong, what was causing his trouble. Now, that was one of my own research was about several different things. One is trying to understand the relationships between these Africans, this group of Africans and wild animals, and how they lived with them. And so I was interested in being able to test certain, since I was a biologist, I was interested in testing how good of predators they really were. Were they prudent predators in the sense, in that they weren't capable or didn't wish to end the game, to kill off all the game, like many Europeans, Britishers in particular, Fraser Darling and Sir Julian Huxley. Does that name mean anything to you? He was an eminent British biologist in the 1930s and 40s, and he was also Director General of UNESCO. And Fraser Darling was a biological consultant of international fame. This is what they were saying about Africans, because they were interested. This was late 1950s. The British were compelled to give up their colonies in Africa, and so that was okay. They could do that because Americans were pushing them to do that, for one thing. The United Nations was as well. But it was something about the environment. These animals, that meant something to them. They were not just belong to Africa. They were a global resource. And British had just as much to do with them as not. So they were interested in putting a fix on the environment because they felt that they had the knowledge and the political will and the funds in order to do it. And that's when national parks and game reserves, remember the two game reserves, were placed on African soil. Those are no-go zones for Africans. It was part of our concept that really we've come out of nature, we evolved out of nature in a way that we can't live within it. And yet it fascinates us. And so we must preserve parts of it so that we can know how far we have progressed out of it. We've civilized ourselves out of nature, unlike other people in the world. And there is a hierarchy of people also, and Africans haven't learned that. And so this is what we're going to teach them. That was part of it. Were Africans that unsavvy? Did they not know what they were doing? Really? And how could I present it? One was in terms of optimal foraging theory, which suggests that they would, if your role was to provide meat, you would go to a group of people, you would maximize your prey, just like predators do. They sort themselves out in terms of the prey animals and only select certain ones that maximize their energy consumption of getting the prey. And so I wanted to find out what that, well, that takes some sophistications in terms of taking observations and putting it in math, in some kind of formula. So this is the ridge that I was talking about of the foothills. Buffalo couldn't get to water there because the stream was very deep where it worked its way through the foothills. But here on the level plains, during the dry seasons, they could get to water without drowning themselves. They could approach it and get to water. And so the proximity of buffalo herds to the fields and to people was not a daily, but perhaps a weekly experience. And this is what, for three months, I kept up with the movements of these herds. They would come from the hinterland, come up, and then go to water during the night, and then come back and out of the fields and back to the hinterlands for grazing and for chewing the cud. And so this is the movement of these three herds of buffalo that came and habituated this particular site. And there were ones that counted that they killed. But the other thing is, you didn't hunt just buffalo as a generic thing. Buffalo came in three different kinds. There were large herds, which is the movements there, or small herds, and buffalo bulls that were thrown out of the herd. And I'll give you some pictures of that. This is a stalk of a herd, of a bull that has come out of the gardens, out of the fields, and this hunter has gotten up early and followed him to this particular stream. And it's at a standstill because this buffalo has seen this hunter. He's trying to decide on what he's going to do about it, and the hunter is standing still because he wants to get as close as he can to that animal on the other side of the bank of the river before he pulls the trigger, right? But the buffalo moves on into the tall grass, and the hunter decides that, well, he'll wait for another day and hope to get a buffalo the next day. And this is what happened to the buffalo the next day. This is a butcher of a buffalo, the same buffalo probably. And here is a patron, who is the chief, who has asked and requested the hunter to go after this buffalo, because one of the ways that he managed the politics of his chieftain was to marry the wives of every lineage, a wife in every lineage. And that was a way that he had to be there a certain part of his time to provide provisions. This was the provisions for his wife and his friends in that particular village. And he would be there, he could talk to them, they could discuss politics and what was going right or wrong, etc. So once the animal was killed, the chief assembled a group of young men and boys to butcher the animals into little packets. And that was perhaps unsanitary, but that was the way that they got the job done. And then each one of those boys would take them back to a household in the village. Now, did it really work? Were they taking too much of these animals, or were they plenty of animals, so that there were these cycles, so that you would start out, this was when the rains would begin. This is where most of the animals dropped their young. There was vegetation, there was cover, they were difficult to see. This is numbers of observations of impala, for example, during these months. and then it drops during that time. They're very, very hard to see because they're very, very secretive during that particular time. But then it comes back in September to be about the same way that it started. So there was a kind of a homeostasis here in terms of animals. You had as many animals at the beginning as at the ending. And there were buffalo, etc. Now here, this was the time when I was getting interested in hunters getting out and helping me map the buffalo, and that's why their numbers are so high. That was either a hell of an important year, and buffalo were all over the place, or it was really an artifact of getting out in the field and counting them as much. And then zebra as well, and warthogs. But then in 1978, it was back. So they were managing these animals. There was a management plan. They were frugal predators, in a way. Now I want to take you through tie some of this together. And this is another strategy of hunting. It's called a malala. And that takes place during the dry season, when most of these animals, which are living very close to the proximity of the village, get spooky. They're flight distance from human beings. They know it's an open terrain. They keep their distance. They know what you're about. They know that you're disturbing them. They keep their distance. Okay, it's very difficult to get close enough to really be able to make a kill. And so you go with a small group and you go to some other waterhole that's far from a village, and you expect to find naive animals there. Now I've mentioned the rubbish pit, and it's rolled between the bush and the village. The village is a place where there's normative expected harmony between people living there, brothers and sisters, right? And in-laws living together. Because if you don't, the ancestors will figure it out, and they will afflict you or do something that causes you difficulty. And that you have to understand, because the elders will tell you about that you aren't living up to snuff, and you aren't living up to norms. Okay, and the women come and sweep the pavement of the village every morning. So it's prepared, the stage is prepared for the dramas that take place during the day. The bush is some other place. Far bush is where evil spirits live. Things happen, people go there, and they don't come back. And the near bush is where most of the products of the village come from, and people are aware of that, feel safe there. Women go there to collect firewood and fish, etc. But the far bush is difficult, and you want to be prepared, and you go prepared there under the auspices of an elder, because they've lived longer than you. They have powers, they have knowledge that they can speak to the issues if they arise. There were 5 men in this party. Some of this you'll show here, but I want to talk about this. Animals as potent symbols. There's also communication with animals, if you know how to do it, because they can tell you things. They are prompted by the spirits too to send you certain things, and this is what this story is about. And they use a short form of chibanda. That means that, they're watching for these animals all the time, and it may be a mongoose of a certain species that they see, and that has a name, and that carries a certain omen. Don't continue your hunt in this particular direction, but go over here or return to base. Or it may encourage them. And it's all associated metaphorically with the name of the animal. Chibanda is something that if you see something and you recognize it as an omen, but you don't understand its meaning, it's not visible immediately, it can be bad, and you watch out for that. Mupashi is something like, it's good, you can see it, you can see its benefit, it's relevant, it's there. It's what you can't see. It's that uncertainty that you can't see, that you're being told about, that you should be aware of and on P's and Q's about. There were 5 men. There was an elder, there was Chibali. He's the man with the hat on, sitting down. This is the second day of our journey. Here's the foothills again. We're on top of the foothills, and in the background is the valley floor. And we're looking over a water hole right beneath us there at some elephants who were coming. And they saw us, and then we were standing hoping that they would see us and not come up and disturb us. And they went back. And then we spent, after they left, we went back to prepare the place where we were going in the ground. That was where we were going to sleep for the night. And we prepared a particular place, took all the vegetation away from it, dug up the roots, and then placed a bunch of foliage around because we were going to sleep there, and if a predator was to come, we would know about it. And then we watched a warthog that was coming to the water. And in spite of the numerous alarm signals given off by a group of birds, honey guides in particular, that there was danger, look out, the warthogs kept coming. And one of these hunters with the gun, it was remarkable. I mean, what they know about animal behavior, because he was using his gun barrel, the reflection on his gun barrel, to move this animal in, because it was a curious animal and he knew it was curious. And so he brought it close enough within gunshot, despite these warnings from the bird. He was kind of ambivalent between what he was going to believe. Was he going to believe his curiosity or these birds? And then he got him to maneuver, believe it or not, from a front target to sideways. Can you imagine? So that he gave a bigger target to his gun blast, and then he killed it. The offshoot of that was that we spent the rest of the afternoon curing that meat, putting it on the fire, and preparing it. And Chipali was the one who was really looking after us. He was the one that was responsible. He went into the forest and got certain magical portions that he then put on the fire before we retired to our site where we were spending the night, and also went on east and west and put some magic and put some charcoal in a tree, and that burned during the night, and that was to protect us from anything happening. Because I asked him, I said, "What are you doing?" He says, "Well, I'm protecting you." I said, "Okay." So we were exhausted. We went to sleep, and about 1 o'clock, they started talking, and Happy, the one who had shot the warthog, was asking the other hunter, he said, "Do you know anything about porcupines? Do you know what porcupines mean? Do you know," because I had a dream, and this porcupine came through this barrier that we had provided and started tapping on my backside and said tapping and woke me up. Can you explain it? I mean, when you have a dream and when you're in the bush, and if you've spent a night in the bush and you hear these animal noises and it was bright moonlight, you don't sleep much. It's difficult to sleep much. And he didn't know. He said, "Well, why don't you ask Chibali?" And Chibali right away said, "It's Chibanda." I don't know, but it's ominous. If that didn't scare us and make us apprehensive, we didn't sleep for the rest of the night. We were really traumatized because we didn't know what to expect. Nobody could explain what had happened, what the dream was. It came from somewhere. It came from on high. And we had to do something about it. What could we do about it? And Chibali decided, well, It's either we see it in the bush or we go back to the village. Those are the two fears that we'll find the answer. And so early the next morning we got up and we walked back along the foothills, and this is what we heard: some animal noises over a slight rise, and they were curious. They didn't know what that was. Maybe that was the answer or what. And so we walked up. The guy in front had an axe. Chibali was behind him, his grandson, then I came, and then the one in behind with the gun, his gun wasn't loaded. They just walked up the ridge, and this is what they saw. A zebra and 3 lionesses and 6 cubs, right at our footsteps. If that didn't put my heart through my throat. I mean, I was really thinking. And one of these guys yelled in Afrikaans, a curse word that I won't repeat. And those lions just took off. I mean, really. I mean, that just really scared me to death. They weren't nervous at all. And what he said, what Chibali said right away was, code switched and said it was Mupashi. That's what your ancestor was telling you. Here is meat. Here is a zebra. Now, how could he determine that? It really takes an understanding of meaning in a cultural setting to get to that, to really be able to reach that resolution so fast. I could feel the weight removed from my shoulders, really. We were different men, henceforth. We went back to the village really joyful souls in the sense of having meat, achieved our missions, and we weren't anticipating any difficulties in the thing. How do you get there? What do porcupines and zebra have in common? You're dealing with a foreign level of classification, of mammalian classification. Stripes. You got it, stripes. If Bisa really categorize animals primarily by color, and you can do it. Most of them are khaki. There's some of them that are black, some of them that are red, like hippopotami. But then there's some who show these anomalous characteristics, stripes. That's symptomatic of something. That tells you something. Those are animals that are prohibited to certain people because when they eat that flesh, they have allergies. That's what you want to do. That's what they were telling. And here meat was provided for us, right? His ancestors had told him that there was meat on the way, but we already had meat. So what Chibali here is telling his grandson, just take a small portion of meat, leave it for the lions, let's go home. And so we went back to the village. And I think it's just about time to go, to leave this village and leave. I just want to remind you that what I was able to show is that there was an order to their world. You had to be there. You had to know how it was. You had to talk to people. You had to learn from them exactly what their order was before you could appreciate it. None of this going through and spending a couple of days, you wouldn't learn very much. A tourist doesn't learn very much when he goes to a place, I can tell you that, really, especially to Africa. There are people there who tell him what to see, tell her what to see, that it's the name of an animal, and then you spend the night in a very comfortable lodge that's very expensive. And to maintain that lodge in that particular situation takes a lot of effort, and you pay very dearly for it. What happened? In the 1970s, those game reserves became national parks, and the game department under the British colony was modernized to be the National Parks and Wildlife Service, and the Zambian economy inflated. What did that do to all the Bisa men that had gone on labor migration? They were back in the village, back to zero, just like everybody else. Without employment, you had to have employment to become a man. Their world had changed in a big way. There was a lot of dissent with the men coming back. There was commercial poaching because they had animals, and that's when all the poaching started. The death of a long-lived chief, the one that I told you about that concocted this lineage husband, external funding and expertise, that was going to save the game. That was going to take care of it. They knew how to manage animals if the BISA didn't. And that they came up with this community-based wildlife system. They appointed a new chair who would follow what the administration wanted, and that was that they would stop killing animals, that they would get cash instead if they would let foreigners see them or kill them, and raise money for state revenues. The state revenues that would come back to them could come back for schools and clinics rather than the needs that the villagers had, and there were additional entrapments. Inflation, everything that you want goes up. There were prolonged droughts, famines, and witchcraft. The scene changed completely. And that's where I want to leave you. I have some other slides, but I think it's time for another recess. And thank you very much for coming.
So it is 6, so if you do, I know some people do have other appointments that run to, feel free to get up and make your way to those if you have other commitments. But I think you'd be willing to entertain a few questions that folks have have those. So if any questions, okay, yeah, way in the back.
Yeah, what was the initial reaction of people to the ad
Sorry?
The initial reaction of the local people to the ad program, were they optimistic? Did they think, oh, there's another kind of paternalistic program?
Well, they were optimistic because they were told in optimistic terms what it would do for them. It would bring them cash. They would have motor transports, which is what the villagers lacked. There would be people would come and would kill animals, and they would pay very high prices. You see, it didn't pay the state anything for local residents to kill animals. They were for eating purpose. It was the same division that you find in the States between those who have to consume animals, and those who hunt for sport. That's a big social distinction. And so they were willing to go along with the state because they didn't have any other option. But they found out that the state, like most state programs, really doesn't live up to the reality that is portrayed in the initial point. And there's been a lot of corruption. In a way, it's a way for the government to get paid for administrating a place that it doesn't have the funds. Because Zambia is a rather weak state. Copper is not the resource for taxes that it used to be. Neither is tourism. That hasn't paid out as well. So you're stuck with poaching is the name of the game, in which you can catch people who are poachers who are outside the law, but you don't catch the big people who are the promoters on the outside, and what they do with the ivory and how they use those funds to do criminal purposes or whatever. So you don't get anywhere in terms of criminalizing poaching locally in this sense. Poaching locally is social protest. They don't like what the government program provides. They don't get the goods that are promised. Yet, they welcome the opportunity of dialogue with government, but it never comes about. This was one instance which government, the chief really got wrapped because they were trying to change the border and put boundaries along the border so that people could not go there. Okay.
So let me ask maybe one last question. So you have this approach of applying each ecological theory to these human behaviors, right? Or trying to see if they are applicable. I'm curious if you discussed that approach with the folks that you're living with, who were kind of your hosts, and what their reaction was, and
their reaction was to your approach?
Well, they don't see themselves as animals in that sense. But all of these documentations I provide to them, really, and we talk about it. I mean, in a way, Malala is a tutorial for me, in a sense that I'm in the group and I learn from them and I hear discussions that I wouldn't hear back in the village. And any hunt was like that, in a sense. You get out there and you're one-on-one with individuals. You can ask them questions. You can ask them why they did that rather than something else, or why did the animals react the way they do. It's a way of learning animal behavior, their knowledge of animal behavior. They understood that, but most of they aren't into theories about that. I mean, it's really, knowledge has a useful, immediate purpose often, and so it should.
Great. Well, thanks, Stuart. I'm filling in for Peter Smallwood, who is off interviewing in Washington, D.C., but he wanted me to remind everybody that the next GESS seminar series is until March 28th, where we have Jessica Hellman, the director of Institute of the Environment, and Professor of Ecology, Evolution, Behavior at the University of Minnesota, who's going to talk to us about the past, present, and future of climate change adaptation. So I look forward to that very much. With that, join me in welcoming Dr. Marks one last time. If you have additional questions, I'm sure there'll be a